When you live in a world made of ice, you learn quickly that mercy is a luxury the dying cannot afford. That is the first lesson Lyra Thorne mastered. The day the last strip of venison vanished from their larder is the day the legends of spring proved to be useless lies. The elders had always spoken of a time when water flowed freely and the sun held warmth, a refuge from the frost. Growing up, Lyra had clung to the foolish hope that perhaps the shifters would lower the barrier, that the snow would melt, and that the gnawing ache in her sister's belly would be replaced by the comfort of a full harvest. But hope was a treacherous thing, as it turned out, because when the wind howls and the frost bites, you realize that waiting for a miracle only prolongs the suffering, and the only promises kept in this frozen hell are the ones you carve out with a knife. The steam rising from the man's skin was the only thing warmer than the ice beneath Lyra's boots. He stood naked in the biting wind, unbothered by the cold that was currently turning Lyra's breath into jagged clouds. He was built like the mountains themselves, hard angles and raw power, but Lyra couldn't take her eyes off the arrow shaft protruding from his chest, just below the collarbone. She notched a second arrow, her frostbitten fingers trembling against the string. The instinct to run screamed in her hindbrain, primal and frantic, but she forced her heels into the snow. Running from a predator only triggered the chase. "Stay back," she warned, her voice raspy from days of silence. The man didn't attack. He laughed, a dark, wet sound that grated against the silence of the woods. "You have sand, little bird," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Lyra's own chest. Most humans would be halfway to the border by now. His eyes were the color of molten gold, the only part of him that still looked like the wolf. He took a casual step forward, as if he were walking across a ballroom floor rather than a killing field. "I said back," Lyra snapped, drawing the string to her cheek until the fletching grazed her skin. "Or the next one goes through your eye." "You aim well," he conceded, glancing down at the iron shaft buried in his pectoral muscle. "But your choice of ammunition is rude." Without breaking eye contact, he wrapped a large hand around the arrow. Lyra flinched, expecting a scream or a snarl. Instead, there was a sickening, wet tear, the sound of metal sliding against bone, and he yanked the weapon free in one brutal motion. Blood welled, dark and fast, spilling down his chest, but even as it flowed, the wound began to knit together. The flesh hissed, closing up before the blood could even freeze. He dropped the wooden shaft into the snow, but kept the iron head gripped in his fist. "Who are you?" Lyra whispered, the terror finally piercing through her adrenaline. She knew the stories. She knew the legends. But seeing one was different. "I am the reason you do not hunt in these woods," he said softly. He moved then, a blur of motion too fast for human eyes to track. One moment, he was 10 paces away. The next, his hand was wrapped around the limb of her bow, pushing it down with effortless strength. He smelled of pine, copper, and raw, terrifying power. "You owe me a blood debt," he murmured, leaning close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You tried to steal a life. By the law of the wilds, yours is now forfeit." Lyra stiffened, locking her knees to keep from collapsing. She thought of her sister, hungry and waiting in the dark cabin. "Do it then," she spat, meeting his golden gaze. "My family will starve either way." He paused, tilting his head as if listening to a frequency she couldn't hear. "Starvation makes you desperate. Desperation makes you dangerous. I have a castle full of sycophants, huntress, but I have no one who can sneak up on me." He released her bow, stepping back to give her air she desperately needed. "You will not die today. You will serve." "Serve?" Lyra choked out, the word tasting like bile. "My warden. My eyes in the dark. You will guard the back of the beast you tried to kill." He reached out, grabbing her gloved hand before she could pull away. He pressed something cold, wet, and sharp into her palm, closing her fingers over it tight. "Keep this," King Kaelen said, a sharp, cruel smile touching his lips as he turned toward the distant, jagged spires of the citadel. Lyra looked down. It was the arrowhead, slick with his blood. "You might need it if I change my mind." The massive obsidian gates groaned open, and the first thing that hit Lyra was the heat. It wasn't the gentle warmth of a hearth. It was a suffocating, decadent blast that carried the heavy scent of roasting boar, spiced wine, and burning cedar. She stumbled, her boots slipping on polished marble that had never known a layer of frost. Kaelen walked ahead, a cloak of midnight fur now thrown over his broad shoulders, hiding the blood she had spilled. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she had nowhere to go. Lyra looked around, and the terror that had been gripping her throat curdled into a black, hot rage. Great iron braziers burned along the walls, consuming more wood in a single hour than her family could scavenge in a month. To her left, long tables groaned under the weight of food she hadn't seen since she was a child. Mounds of dark bread, bowls of glistening grapes, and platters of meat dripping with fat. Her stomach gave a violent, painful twist, a reminder of the empty gnawing that had defined her existence for 3 years. Her sister was chewing on boiled leather strips tonight. Her mother was coughing in a drafty cabin. And here, these monsters were feasting in a fortress of gluttony, insulated from the hell they had created outside. "Keep up," Kaelen commanded, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. They passed through archways of gold and bone, entering the great hall. The low hum of conversation died instantly. The court was a sea of silks and velvets, populated by creatures that looked human but stood with a predatory stillness no man could mimic. They were beautiful in a sharp, terrifying way, skin too perfect, eyes too bright, movements too fluid. They turned as one, their attention snapping to the intruders. Then came the sound. It started as a soft inhalation, dozens of noses twitching, testing the air. The scent of fresh blood, Kaelen's blood, was on her hands, but beneath that was the undeniable, copper-sweet tang of a human. A woman near the front, draped in silver fox fur, stepped forward. Her lip curled back, revealing canines that were too long, too sharp. A low, vibrating rattle ripped from her throat, a sound that triggered a chain reaction. The room filled with growls, a chorus of clicking teeth and shifting stances. They weren't looking at a guest. They were looking at prey that had foolishly wandered into the den. Lyra's hand went instinctively to the empty sheath at her hip. She was weaponless, dirty, and surrounded by wolves in courtier's clothing. The woman in silver lunged, her fingernails lengthening into talons, eyes fixed on Lyra's throat. Growl. The sound didn't just come from Kaelen's throat. It seemed to vibrate through the floor, the walls, and the very air. It was a thunderclap of pure dominance that rattled Lyra's teeth and forced the air from her lungs. Kaelen hadn't shifted, but his shadow seemed to stretch, monstrous and vast across the marble. He stood between Lyra and the court, his back to her, facing down the pack. The silence that followed was absolute, brittle as ice. "She is not meat," Kaelen said. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly calm, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. He swept his gaze over the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. He reached back, grabbing Lyra by the wrist and pulling her roughly to his side, displaying her like a trophy or a warning. "She is the Warden," he declared, his golden eyes burning into the woman in silver. "And she is mine." The submission was immediate. Next bared, eyes lowered to the floor. But as Kaelen dragged her toward the dais, Lyra didn't feel safe. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his claim, and the cold realization that she had traded the freedom of the snow for a cage of gold. The heavy oak doors of the royal solar clicked shut, cutting off the murmurs of the court. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the crackle of the hearth fire. Kaelen didn't relax. He prowled to the window, staring out at the frozen expanse of his kingdom. He looked less like a king and more like a caged animal pacing the perimeter of a trap. "You're confused," he said, not turning around. "You're wondering why an alpha needs a human nursemaid." "I'm wondering which window is the easiest to jump from," Lyra replied, eyeing the drop. Kaelen turned, a dry amusement touching his lips. "None. The fall won't kill you, but the wards will." He gestured to the room, to the empty shadows. "The court you just saw? Half of them pray for my long reign. The other half are waiting for High Lord Vane to give the signal to slit my throat. My royal guard is compromised. They bow to me, but they answer to him. So you brought me here to die with you? I brought you here because you are the only thing in this castle that doesn't smell like magic and deceit, Kaelen said, his voice hardening. You smell like pine needles and old blood. You see the world in kill zones and escape routes. I don't need a courtier, Lyra. I need a hunter. Someone who sees a threat before it strikes. A knock at the service door interrupted him. A young servant boy entered, eyes lowered, carrying a silver tray laden with roasted pheasant in a dark berry glaze. The scent hit Lyra like a physical blow, rich, savory, and dizzying after days of starvation. Her mouth watered painfully. The boy set the tray on the low table between two velvet armchairs. Your supper, my liege, he murmured, backing away quickly. Kaelen sighed, the exhaustion finally showing in the slump of his shoulders. He reached for the knife, slicing a piece of the dark meat. Eat, he told Lyra, gesturing to the other plate. You're useless to me if you faint from hunger. Lyra stepped forward, her hand reaching for the bread. But as she leaned over the table, a secondary scent cut through the aroma of roasted bird and rosemary. It was faint, sweet, and cloying. Bitter almonds. In the wild, almonds didn't grow in winter. And in a kitchen, they were never used to glaze pheasant. Kaelen lifted the fork to his mouth. Don't. Lyra moved on instinct. She slapped the fork from his hand. It clattered across the room, leaving a smear of sauce on the rug. Kaelen was on his feet in a heartbeat, a low snarl ripping from his chest, his hand closing around Lyra's throat before she could blink. He pinned her against the stone mantel, his eyes flashing gold. Have you lost your mind, human? He hissed. Lyra clawed at his wrist, gasping for air. Smell it, she choked out. The glaze. Smell it. Kaelen froze. He didn't release her, but he turned his head, inhaling deeply near the spilled food. His nostrils flared. The golden light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a cold, devastating realization. He released her abruptly. Lyra slumped against the hearth, rubbing her neck. Cyanide, she rasped. Crushed peach pits or bitter almond. A hunter's trick to kill foxes without spoiling the pelt. Kaelen stared at the ruined meal. He looked at the fork on the floor, then back at Lyra. For the first time, the arrogance vanished, leaving behind a stark, unsettled vulnerability. He had nearly died in his own chambers, by his own servant's hand. You saved me, he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. I saved my meal ticket, Lyra corrected, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. If you die, the pack tears me apart before your body hits the floor. Kaelen held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, he reached for his belt dagger, cut a chunk of cheese from a sealed wheel on the sideboard, and tossed it to her. Check that for poison, he said, though the corner of his mouth quirked upward. It's clean, she said, catching it. Then eat, Kaelen replied, sitting back down, his eyes never leaving hers. We have a long night ahead, Warden. The midnight patrol was usually quiet, but tonight the Citadel groaned like a dying beast. Lyra could feel the vibrations through the soles of her boots as she navigated the twisting corridors toward the throne room. The air grew colder with every step, a biting chill that ignored the furs Kaelen had provided. She pushed open the heavy double doors, expecting to find the king asleep or plotting with his generals. Instead, she found him alone, and for the first time, she saw the monster not as a predator, but as prey being slowly digested. Kaelen sat on the obsidian throne, his hands gripping the stone armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. His head was thrown back, eyes squeezed shut, and his chest heaved in shallow, ragged gasps. But it was the silence that terrified her. The usual howl of the wind outside had ceased, replaced by a heavy, oppressive pressure against the castle walls. Tendrils of silver light were bleeding out of Kaelen's skin, flowing down his arms and into the floor, pulsing outward like a heartbeat. The stone of the castle was drinking him dry. Lyra took a step forward, the movement breaking her paralysis. Kaelen. He didn't answer. A layer of frost had formed on his eyelashes. His skin was the color of old ash. She moved closer, her hunter's eyes scanning the room. She had always believed the shifters summoned the winter to punish humanity. She had believed Kaelen was the Lord of the Ice. But looking at the agony etched into his features, the way his life force was being siphoned into the foundations of the Citadel, the truth slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't summoning the storm. He was the dam holding it back. The tyrant, who demanded tribute, was bleeding himself dry every night to keep the void winter from crushing them all, human and shifter alike. "You're going to kill yourself?" she whispered, the realization trembling in her voice. Kaelen let out a shuddering breath, the silver light flickering. "It holds," he rasped, the words barely audible. "The barrier holds." He slumped forward, the connection severing as exhaustion took him. Lyra caught him before he hit the floor, dropping to her knees to support his weight. He was freezing to the touch, a block of ice in the shape of a man. Without thinking, she reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. The moment skin touched skin, a shockwave tore through them both. It wasn't pain, it was a sudden, violent rush of warmth, a golden tether snapping into place. The arrow wound on his chest flared with heat, and Lyra felt a phantom echo of it in her own heart. For a heartbeat, the king vanished. Kaelen let out a low, desperate sound, half groan, half whimper, and leaned into her touch. He pressed his forehead against her arm, seeking the warmth she offered, surrendering to the momentary relief of being held rather than holding up the world. Lyra froze, her breath catching. The bond hummed between them, terrifying and undeniable. She felt his exhaustion as if it were her own heavy limbs. She felt the crushing loneliness of 100 years of winter. Then, as quickly as it had happened, he ripped himself away. Kaelen scrambled back against the throne, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and wild with gold fire. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with panic. "Don't," he snarled, his voice cracking. He wiped a trembling hand across his mouth, rebuilding his walls brick by brick. "Do not touch me, Lyra. That is a line you cannot cross." Lyra remained on her knees, her hand still hovering in the air, the warmth of his skin lingering on her palm like a brand. She saw the fear in him now. He wasn't afraid of the winter. He was afraid of the thaw. The glass gardens were a cemetery of frozen blooms, where roses encased in ice glittered like jagged diamonds under the moonlight. Kaelen walked 3 paces ahead of her, his silence heavy and brooding. Since the night in the throne room, he had treated her less like a warden and more like a contagious disease, keeping his distance as if the mere brush of their sleeves would shatter him. "You're walking too loud," Lyra murmured, her eyes scanning the twisting labyrinth of frozen hedges. "If you want to survive the winter, stop stomping like a conquistador." Kaelen stopped, turning with a sneer ready on his lips. "I am a predator, Lyra. I do not need to tiptoe in my own." The air shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden displacement of pressure. A shadow detached itself from a towering oak, massive and snarling. "Move!" Kaelen roared. He didn't reach for a weapon. He shoved Lyra into a snowbank with enough force to bruise, placing his body between her and the blur of gray fur hurtling toward them. In midair, Kaelen's form shattered. There was the sickening crack of bone, the tearing of silk, and then the white wolf stood in his place. A creature of nightmare and majesty, twice the size of a timber wolf, with fur like starlight and teeth like iron spikes. The assassin, a hulking, gray-skinned shifter with the features of a bear, crashed into him. The impact shook the ground. Lyra scrambled to her feet, her hand flying to her bow. The 2 beasts were a rolling avalanche of violence, a tangle of claws and snapping jaws. Blood sprayed across the pristine white snow, red on white, stark and horrified. "Kaelen," she screamed. The assassin had the weight advantage. He pinned the white wolf, jaws clamping down on Kaelen's shoulder. Kaelen thrashed, his hind legs raking at the enemy's belly, but he was losing leverage. Lyra drew an arrow, but she couldn't loose. The shot was too risky. A millimeter of error would put the shaft through Kaelen's throat. She needed height. She needed an angle. The white wolf locked eyes with her. In that chaotic, bloody second, the bond flared hot in her chest. She didn't hear a voice, but she felt the intent. Now, Kaelen bucked, throwing the bear off for a fraction of a second. Instead of lunging for the kill, he dropped low, crouching into the snow, his hackles raised. Lyra didn't think. She sprinted. She planted a boot on the white wolf's powerful hindquarter and vaulted upward. Kaelen rose to meet her momentum, a living catapult. For a terrifying, exhilarating moment, she was atop the beast, her knees clamping around his ribs, her body rising and falling with his breath. She was no longer a human fighting a monster. She was the rider. He was the steed. Kaelen lunged at the recovering assassin, but he didn't bite. He feinted, snarling to draw the bear's head up, exposing the throat. Lyra drew the string to her cheek. The world narrowed down to the tip of her arrow. She felt Kaelen's muscles bunch, felt him hold perfectly still at the apex of his lunge, granting her a platform of absolute stability. Thwack! The arrow flew. It struck the assassin beneath the jaw, severing the spine instantly. The gray beast collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Kaelen landed softly, absorbing the impact. Lyra slid from his back, her boots hitting the snow, her chest heaving. The white wolf turned to her, blood dripping from his muzzle, his golden eyes wide and unblinking. There was no fear in her now, only the electric, terrifying realization that they moved as one soul split in two. She reached out, her hand trembling, and this time, he didn't pull away. He leaned into her palm, letting out a breath that ghosted over her face like a promise. The fire in the royal solar was a roaring beast, but Lyra shivered as the sting of alcohol bit into her skin. She sat on the edge of the velvet chaise, her sleeve rolled up to reveal a jagged tear in her forearm, a souvenir from the assassin's claws. Kaelen knelt before her, a basin of warm water and a linen cloth in his hands. He was human again, though the feral energy of the wolf still clung to him, evident in the rigid tension of his jaw and the predatory grace of his movements. He dabbed at the wound with a gentleness that seemed at war with the violence she had just witnessed in the garden. "I can do it myself," Lyra muttered, instinctively pulling her arm back. "Hold still, Warden," Kaelen commanded softly, his grip on her wrist firm but bruising. "You protected the crown. The least the crown can do is clean up the mess." He worked in silence for a moment, the only sound the popping of the firewood. Lyra watched him through her lashes. His shirt was unbuttoned, revealing the angry, pink scar on his chest where her arrow had pierced him days ago. It was a stark, ugly thing against his pale skin, a brand of her hatred. "Why do you hunt?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from her arm. "You have the skill of a soldier, but you fight like a scavenger." "Soldiers fight for flags," Lyra said, her voice hollow. "Scavengers fight for dinner. My sister hasn't seen a fresh apple in 3 years, Kaelen. She's 7. She thinks the world is supposed to be white and dead." She looked away, the anger simmering low in her gut. "I hunt because the winter you brought is killing us slowly. I'd rather die fast on a fong than starve by inches." Kaelen stopped. He dropped the cloth into the basin, the water turning pink. He sat back on his heels, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked up at her. The golden fire in his eyes was dim, replaced by a weary, ancient sadness. "I didn't bring the winter, Lyra. You are the alpha," she countered. "The magic flows from you." "The magic drains from me," he corrected. "The void is an ancient rod, older than my bloodline. It pushes against the barriers of this realm every hour of every day. If I stop pushing back, the ice doesn't just cover the land, it crushes it." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the frozen woods where they had first met. "That day in the forest," he said quietly, "I wasn't stalking the treeline for sport. I wasn't looking for human prey to torment." He met her gaze, his expression open and devastatingly honest. "I was tracking a ley line. I was looking for a fracture in the earth, a way to channel the geothermal heat to the surface. I was trying to melt the snow near your village so your people could plant crops again." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face. The room suddenly felt very small, the air too thin to breathe. She looked at the scar on his chest again. She hadn't shot a monster terrorizing her home. She had shot the only man trying to save it. "You were trying to help us." she whispered, the guilt settling in her stomach like a stone. And I put an iron broadhead in your chest. Kaelen stood up, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply stated the fact. You saw a wolf, Lyra. The world has taught you that wolves only know how to bite. He walked to the window, turning his back to her, isolating himself once more. I just wish you had hesitated long enough to see that this one was trying to keep you warm. The blood moon hung low and heavy over the citadel, staining the pristine snow of the courtyard a bruised, violent purple. Inside the great hall, the atmosphere was suffocating. This was no celebration. It was a gathering of wolves waiting to see which member of the pack was weak enough to be eaten. Lyra stood in the shadows behind the obsidian throne, her hand resting on the hilt of a silver-tipped dagger. She wore formal leathers now, stiff and uncomfortable, but her eyes were the same restless, scanning eyes of the huntress. The room was filled with the alphas of the subordinate clans, Bear, Fox, Viper, but the tension radiated from the entrance, where the heavy doors swung open with a resounding boom. High Lord Vayne entered. He was a massive figure, draped in furs that looked suspiciously like the pelts of rival shifters. His presence sucked the air out of the room. He didn't bow. He walked straight to the center of the hall, his boots echoing like hammer strikes on the marble. Behind him trailed a dozen of his elite guard, their eyes hard and hungry. Kaelen remained seated, his face a mask of bored indifference, though Lyra could feel the tension radiating off him in waves through their bond. It tasted like ash and ozone. You're late, Uncle, Kaelen said, his voice smooth but carrying a dangerous edge. Did the road prove too difficult for your old bones? Vayne laughed, a sound like grinding stones. The road was clear, nephew. It was the stench of the citadel that slowed me down. It smells domestic. Vayne's eyes, pale and colorless as a winter sky, snapped to Lyra. He didn't look at her as a threat. He looked at her as a symptom of a disease. I see the rumor is true, Vayne sneered, taking a step closer to the dais. You keep a human pet, and not just any human, a hunter, a creature that skins our kind for sport. She is the Warden, Kaelen replied, his hand tightening imperceptibly on the armrest. And she is under my protection. Protection? Vayne spat the word. He prowled closer, ignoring the growls rising from Kaelen's loyalists. Since when does the wolf protect the sheep? Since when does the Winter King bleed his own magic dry to keep the frost from biting the toes of mortals? Lyra stiffened. He knew. Vayne turned to the crowd, his voice rising to a theatrical boom. Look at him. He sits on the throne of our ancestors, yet he is hollowed out. He pours his power into the earth to save them. He pointed a clawed finger at Lyra, while our borders weaken. He is not ruling this kingdom. He is starving it to feed a ghost. Kaelen stood slowly, his height impressive, but Lyra saw the slight tremor in his legs. The exhaustion from holding the barrier was eating him alive, and Vayne could smell it. I keep the void at bay, Kaelen growled, his eyes beginning to glow. I keep us all from being unmade. You keep us from our true nature. Vayne roared. And you do it because you have grown soft. You have let a human heart beat inside that chest, and it has poisoned you. Vayne ripped off his heavy fur cloak, throwing it to the floor. Underneath, he was armored in black steel, a sword strapped to his hip. The pack cannot be led by a cripple, Vayne declared, the silence in the hall absolute. You are compromised, Kaelen. Your blood is tainted by your fondness for this meat. He drew his sword, the metal singing a high, lethal note. He pointed the tip at Kaelen's throat. I invoke the right of blood and ash. I challenge you for the crown. Here, now, to the death. The duel was not a fight, it was a slaughter. Kaelen moved like a man wading through deep water. His parries were a fraction of a second too slow, his strikes lacking the devastating force Lyra knew he possessed. Vayne, by contrast, was a blur of black steel and feral aggression. He batted Kaelen's sword aside with a laugh, driving a heavy boot into the king's chest. Kaelen stumbled back, crashing into the dais steps. He shook his head, blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear a thick fog from his vision. Through the bond, Lyra felt it. Not pain, but a sickening, heavy numbness. a lethargy that tasted of poppy milk and nightshade. He's been drugged, Lyra realized, her blood running cold. Vayne hadn't just challenged him. He had ensured the outcome hours ago. Is this the Alpha? Vayne roared to the crowd, circling his fallen nephew. Is this the monster you fear? He can barely lift his blade. The court watched in terrified silence. No one moved to intervene. To interfere in a challenge of blood was to forfeit one's own life. Vayne lunged. Kaelen managed to bring his sword up, but his arm buckled under the impact. Vayne's blade sliced across Kaelen's thigh, drawing a spray of bright arterial blood. Kaelen hit the floor hard, his sword clattering out of reach. Lyra's hand went to her hip, but she stopped. If she charged the floor, Vayne's guards would cut her down before she took 3 steps. She couldn't fight a room full of shifters. She was human. She was small. She was breakable. But she was a hunter, and a hunter never fights on the prey's terms. She turned and sprinted, not toward the fight, but toward the heavy velvet tapestries hanging along the eastern wall. She scrambled up the stone relief, her boots finding purchase on the ancient carvings, hauling herself up to the musician's balcony overlooking the hall. Below, Vayne kicked Kaelen onto his back. The High Lord placed a heavy boot on Kaelen's throat, pinning him to the cold marble. He raised his greatsword with both hands, the tip poised to drive down through the king's heart. Look at him, Vayne sneered, savoring the kill. Die like the dog you are. Lyra reached into her tunic. Her fingers closed around the object she had carried against her skin since the day she arrived. The arrow. The shaft was broken, but the head was iron, and the wood was stained dark with the blood of the king. She didn't have her bow. She didn't need it. She vaulted over the railing, plummeting 15 feet toward the chaos. She didn't aim for the floor. She aimed for the monster. She landed on Vayne's back just as he began his downward thrust. The impact knocked the breath out of him, sending his aim wide. The greatsword sparked against the stone inches from Kaelen's ear. Vayne roared, thrashing to throw her off, but Lyra wrapped her legs around his torso, locking her ankles. She raised the broken arrow high, the iron tip glinting in the torchlight. Get away from him, she screamed. She drove the arrow down. She didn't aim for the armor. She aimed for the gap at the neck, right where the trap muscle met the shoulder. The iron sank deep. Vayne howled, a sound of pure, shocking agony as the metal burned his shifter flesh. He released the sword, clawing at his back, stumbling away from Kaelen to rip Lyra off him. He threw her hard. She skidded across the marble, crashing into the base of the throne. The world spun, breathless and bruised, but she looked up. The distraction was enough. The haze in Kaelen's eyes shattered. Pain and rage burned through the drug. He didn't reach for his sword. He reached for the beast inside. With a bone-shaking snarl, the man vanished, and the white wolf exploded from his skin, massive, terrified, and ready to kill. The white wolf did not fight with the clumsy rage of the High Lord. He fought with the terrifying, silent efficiency of winter itself. Vayne, weakened by the iron shard still buried in his shoulder, swung his greatsword in a wide, desperate arc, but he was striking at smoke. Kaelen ducked under the blade, his massive paws slamming into Vayne's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact cracked the marble floor. Vayne went down, gasping, and before he could scramble away, the white wolf was on top of him, jaws clamped around the High Lord's armored throat. The great hall fell into a silence so profound Lyra could hear the hiss of the torches. Vayne squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the tear, the spray of blood, the end. But the bite never came. Kaelen held him there for a long, agonizing heartbeat, dominance absolute, power undeniable. Then, with a low, dismissive huff, he released him. He stepped back, looking down at the defeated challenger not with hatred, but with a cold, kingly pity. By sparing him, he had done something worse than kill him. He had proven Vayne wrong. The human heart hadn't made Kaelen weak. It had made him disciplined. The air shimmered, heat rolling off the wolf in waves, until Kaelen stood in his place, bruised, bleeding, and breathing hard, but unmistakably the king. Get him out of my sight, Kaelen rasped to the guards. As Vayne was dragged away, the court turned. Hundreds of golden, amber, and silver eyes fixed on the dais. But they weren't looking at Kaelen. They were looking at Lyra. She stood by the throne, her tunic torn, blood smeared on her cheek, looking small and fragile against the scale of the monsters surrounding her. One by one, the alphas of the clans dropped to one knee. They didn't bow to her as a queen, but they bowed to the warden who had thrown herself into the jaws of a beast to save their king. Kaelen didn't look at them. He walked straight to Lyra, ignoring his own wounds. He stopped inches from her, his gaze scanning her frantically for broken bones. "You foolish, reckless creature," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You could have been killed." "I had the high ground," Lyra said, though her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Kaelen reached out, his thumb grazing the bruise forming on her jaw, but he stopped himself. He pulled his hand back, his expression hardening into a painful resolve. "The debt is paid, Lyra," he said, his voice rough. "You saved my life. By the law of the wilds, you are free. The gates are open. Go back to your sister. Go back to the spring I promised you." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. He was giving her everything she had hunted for, her freedom, her family's safety, the end of the winter. Lyra looked at the open doors. She thought of the cabin, the silence of the woods, the safety of a life without monsters. Then she looked at the man standing alone in the center of the room, the man who bled to keep the world warm, the man who had looked at her not as a meal, but as an equal. She reached down to where her bow lay on the steps, the weapon she had carried to kill him. She lifted it, feeling the familiar weight, and then let it clatter to the stone floor. Kaelen's eyes widened. Lyra closed the distance between them. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined coat and yanked him down, pressing her mouth to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It tasted of iron, smoke, and survival. Kaelen froze for a heartbeat, then groaned, his arms wrapping around her waist to crush her against him, burying his face in her neck. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered against his mouth. "I'm not leaving my kill." The first sound of spring was not a bird song, but a roar. It was the sound of the world cracking open, the violent, thunderous fracture of the great glaciers receding, their meltwater turning dry creek beds into rushing rivers. For the first time in a century, the wind did not bite. It breathed. Lyra stood atop the battlements of the citadel, the stone warm beneath her hands. The sun was high and unyielding, turning the white expanse of the valley into a patchwork of brown mud and startling, vibrant green. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, a scent so rich it made her head spin after a lifetime of breathing nothing but sterile frost. "They're here," Kaelen said softly, stepping up beside her. He didn't wear his crown. He wore a simple tunic, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the faint silver scar on his forearm where the magic used to bleed him dry. He looked younger now, the perpetual gray exhaustion wiped from his skin by the return of the sun. Lyra leaned over the parapet. Far below, winding up the newly cleared road, was a battered wagon pulled by two sturdy draft horses. She didn't wait. She turned and ran, taking the stone steps two at a time, ignoring the startled gasps of the shifter guards who scrambled to open the heavy iron gates. She hit the mud of the courtyard just as the wagon rolled to a halt. A small, ragged figure jumped from the back, stumbling on legs that were too thin, too shaky. "Lyra." Her sister's voice was a bird's chirp, fragile and desperate. Lyra fell to her knees in the mud, opening her arms just in time to catch the impact of the small body. She buried her face in her sister's matted hair, smelling wood smoke and old fear, and held on tight enough to bruise. "I told you," Lyra choked out, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I told you I'd come back." Her mother climbed down slowly, looking at the towering obsidian walls and the gathered shifters with wide, terrified eyes. She held a hand to her chest, as if waiting to wake up from a dream. "The winter," her mother whispered, looking at the green shoots pushing through the slush. "It stopped, Lyra. It just stopped. It won't return," a deep voice rumbled. Kaelen approached, the sunlight catching the gold in his eyes. The pack, guards, courtiers, servants, formed a circle, but they didn't crowd. They kept their heads lowered, a sign of respect that had nothing to do with fear. Lyra's mother shrank back, instinctively shielding the child, her eyes darting to the scars on Kaelen's chest. She saw a monster. Lyra stood up, keeping one hand on her sister's shoulder. She reached out with the other, taking Kaelen's hand. She interlaced their fingers, displaying the bond for her family and the kingdom to see. "Mama," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear. "This is Kaelen." Kaelen didn't bow like a king. He inclined his head like a guardian. "Your daughter saved my life, madam," he said, his voice gentle. "My home is yours. There is food in the hall. There is fire in the hearth. And you will never be cold again." He looked at Lyra then, and the look passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the blood, the snow, and the arrow that had bound them together. She had gone into the woods to hunt a beast to fill a single pot. She had returned with the wolf who would feed the world. Lyra squeezed the king's hand, feeling the pulse of the earth beating in time with his heart. She looked out at the thawing land, where the ice was dying and the world was beginning. "Come inside," the first human queen of the shifters said to her family. "Dinner is ready. The ice has melted, but the hunt is just beginning." Lyra went into the woods to find a meal and came back with a king. If you crave stories where the prey becomes the predator and love is forged in blood and snow, smash that subscribe button. Ring the bell to join the pack, because in this world, if you aren't hunting, you're being hunted. The next chapter is waiting. Are you brave enough to turn the page?